Good evening. I'm Patricia McLaughlin with the Center for East Asian Studies, and I'd like to welcome you to the second lecture in our Distinguished Speakers in East Asia series. I recognize some people who were here in the fall when we launched this series with a lecture by Bill Emmett, the former editor-in-chief of The Economist, who spoke on the recent economic and political developments in Japan and Japan's position in the region. And today we're honored to have Dean Stephen Bosworth speak to us about the ongoing problems on the Korean Peninsula. And I'd just like to bring to your attention that the third and final lecture in this series will be on November 5th, when Robert Hormats, a noted China expert and currently a vice chairman of Goldman Sachs, will be here to talk about the rise of China. This is an unusual series for us. It's sponsored by the Center for East Asian Studies, CYBER, the Center for International Business Education and Research, and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And I think it's fair to say that this is the first time that these three institutions have collaborated so extensively in an ongoing event, and certainly the first time in the field of East Asian studies. And it's our hope that the institutional momentum that's been gained by this collaboration will continue above and beyond this series. On that note, I'd like to thank several people who've made this series possible. First of all, Deirdre Mendez, who's sitting at the front. She's with CYBER. She's the associate director. She and her director, David Platt, who can't be here this afternoon, organized a very successful breakfast meeting this morning with the business community, legal community of Austin at the Intercontinental Hotel, in which Dean Bosworth spoke about trends in the region. I'd also like to thank Dean Steinberg from the LBJ School for his encouragement behind this series, and also Brendan Levy, who organized much of the advertising for this. Thank you also to Strasburger, attorneys at law, whose generous support have made this possible. And finally, to the POSCO Korea Foundation. Although we don't have any representatives here today, it is POSCO that has enabled our small Korea program to flourish under the able leadership of Dr. Robert Oppenheim. So thank you all. And finally, I'd like to single out Anthony Bonville, who is a friend of East Asia and the LBJ School, and he's now a PhD student in the Department of History. And Anthony has single-handedly organized an organization of graduate students which will meet following the lecture and reception from centers around the campus. And again, this is, I think, novel. The first time that we've seen so much integration amongst students from so many venues on campus, and I commend him on that. And I also hope that that organization as well will achieve some institutional permanence in the months ahead, well and beyond the termination of this series. So I'd like to welcome you all. Please stick around afterwards. We'll be having a reception, lots of food and drink and mingling. Before we hear from our speaker, though, I would like to ask James Steinberg to come up with some introductions. So welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Patty, and welcome. I want to just echo Patty's remarks about the tremendous opportunity that this has afforded us all to begin to get to know each other and work together on issues of common interest in East Asia. It's a tremendously important and exciting area with great opportunities and challenges for us across the board, whether it's in science or technology or the humanities or public affairs. We all have a considerable interest in developments in the region, and so I'm glad to see so many people from so many different schools here. It's also an enormous pleasure for me to be able to introduce Ambassador Steve Bosworth, or Dean Steve Bosworth. It's really a higher honorific, I think, than ambassador. As you know, Ambassador Bosworth is Dean of the Fletcher School, which is just a terrific institution in my home state, and a really important source of many ideas and leaders over generations for the United States and from abroad, with so many international students there as well. He's had a remarkable career of public service as a Foreign Service officer, serving around the world, but particularly with distinction in East Asia. As you all know, he's been our ambassador to the Philippines during a very critical period in that country's history, and then served after his formal years as a Foreign Service officer as the head of KEDO, the Korean Energy Development Organization, which some of us had a little bit of a hand in creating to implement the agreed framework for the first attempt to solve the North Korean nuclear problem in the early 1990s, and then was willing, with a little bit of arm twisting, to come back and serve as our ambassador to South Korea at the end of the Clinton administration. I'm particularly honored to introduce him because I've known Steve in a variety of capacities, but he lived with me for 2.5 years, at least virtually, because there's a tradition in the State Department that for each of the offices of the assistant secretaries that you have pictures on the wall of your predecessors. And among the many distinguished positions that Steve has held over the years was Director of Policy Planning. And so beginning in March of 1994, when I became Director of Policy Planning, every morning I walked into my office and I saw Steve's smiling face looking down at me, urging me on to greater and better things. And that was a 2.5-year inspiration. So I don't want to take up any more time because there's probably nobody better situated to discuss the topic we're going to talk today about, which is the crisis on the Korean Peninsula and the possibilities of the ways forward, than Ambassador Steve Bosworth. So.
Jim, thank you very much. I would agree with you. At present, Dean is a higher honorific than Ambassador. I used to do a lot of speaking in Japan, and I took away one very important lesson, which was delivered to me with some forcefulness by a Japanese senior official. He said, "Bosworth, you have to understand, in Japan, you should always, even though someone has introduced you, you should always introduce yourself. So I'm Steve Bosworth, Dean of the Fletcher School. It's a pleasure to be here." The second piece of advice he gave me was very easy to follow as well, and that was, he said, never try to tell jokes to a Japanese audience. And I've extended that to, by and large, American audiences. So I don't try to start with jokes. I am going to talk about the Korean Peninsula and how we got to where we are, where we may be going, and some of the prospects for the longer term. I think it's important to start with the realization that the Korean civilization is one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. Korea considers itself a culture and a society and a civilization which has existed for over 3,000 years. The Koreans, because they are sandwiched between China in the north and that powerful set of islands to the south, have continually felt like, as they would say, the shrimp between two whales. And when the whales fight, the shrimp's back can be broken all too easily. I think at present that underplays Korean influence and Korean power, but it is nonetheless part of the Korean mindset. The Koreans consider that they were subject to invasion from Japan, invasion from China, so that the current separation of Korea, division of Korea, if you will, is for them very much a temporary condition and one which will eventually be overcome. As to why they are divided, it is sort of one of the classic examples of the kind of mindlessness of international affairs. In 1945, at the end of World War II, and many of you I'm sure know this story, but the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, entered World War II in the very last days and plunged down from the north into the Korean Peninsula. The United States had landed in Korea and was moving up from the south. The two armies met at approximately the 38th parallel, and two colonels from the U.S. Army met with some officers of the Soviet Army and decided that the U.S. would take the surrender of the Japanese forces in the south, and the north, or the Soviets would take the surrender of the Japanese forces in the north. The line they decided upon was roughly the 38th parallel, and that, of course, remains the line of division between North and South Korea today. By the way, one of the American colonels who was engaged in this exercise was a man named Dean Rusk, who had to then, for his sins, live with the repercussions and consequences of this division of Korea when he was Secretary of State in the the 1960s. That was obviously an artificial division, but it had great consequences. In the North, the Soviets supported the reintroduction of forces led by Kim Il-sung, who had led resistance forces against the Japanese from a base in China during the period of World War II. The U.S., because we took the surrender of the Japanese, for a time were an occupying power in the South. And we each put in place administrative forces or units which became governments. The problem was that neither side really reflected on or accepted the authority of the other. So there was, from 1945 through the late 40s, a protracted period of guerrilla fighting, insurgency across the 38th parallel, and almost constant conflict. In 1950, that culminated in a decision by North Korea, as we now know through historical records, encouraged by the Soviet Union, to launch a full frontal invasion of South Korea, which was in the initial months quite successful. And in fact, almost before we knew it, the U.S. and South Korean forces, which were very outnumbered, ended up in the so-called Pusan perimeter, very tight defensive perimeter around the city of Pusan in the extreme tip of South Korea. General MacArthur then countered with his invasion at Incheon, which cut the North Korean forces in half and began driving north. Unfortunately, MacArthur's appetite was difficult to control, and he went too far north, far enough at least to engage or to cause the Chinese forces to become engaged on the side of the North Koreans. So we were again pushed back, and over a period of roughly 3 years, we traded territory, and in 1953 ended up pretty much where it had all started. And we put in place, negotiating with the North Koreans and the Chinese, an armistice, and we established the demilitarized zone. But it was an armistice. It was not a peace treaty. And that armistice remains in effect today, and that demilitarized zone remains the line of demarcation between North Korea and South Korea. The United States stayed on at this point in South Korea. We viewed the Korean Peninsula as a key link in our global containment of the Soviet Union, and we committed ourselves to the defense of South Korea. We had actually lost, as you all know, a considerable number of American troops in the Korean War, and there was a natural feeling and a strategic reason for us to remain engaged. U.S. forces in South Korea were at that time quite large, over 100,000, and we maintained that force for some years. It has since been reduced steadily, beginning in the 1970s, and we've now reduced our forces there to about 25,000. But for many years, we dealt with, in conjunction with our allies, the South Koreans, we dealt with the threat from North Korea largely through a policy of deterrence. We had in place forces which we believed, and South Koreans were generally assured, were sufficient to counter any attempt on the part of North Koreans to conquer South Korea by force. For most of the 50s and into the 60s, this kind of standoff remained in place. The South Koreans were the recipients of enormous amounts of assistance from the former Soviet Union and from China. South Korea was, of course, the recipient of assistance from the United States, and the UN resolution under which we had mounted our defense of South Korea remained basically the organizing concept for the U.S. presence and other allied presences in South Korea. For a long time, it looked as though it was going to be a close contest as to which end of Korea was going to succeed economically. in the 1970s, the mid-1970s, in fact, the per capita income in North Korea was higher than the per capita income in South Korea. This began to shift very rapidly in the late 70s and the 80s, and particularly in the 90s, as South Korea took off economically. South Korea, whose per capita GNP in 1960 was roughly $100 per person, now has a per capita income of some $14,000 per person. In the meantime, the economic condition of North Korea began to steadily deteriorate, largely as a result of the economic policies that they were pursuing, but particularly beginning with the early 1990s when aid from the Soviet Union disappeared as the Soviet Union disappeared. And North Korea's fundamental economic weaknesses were revealed very vividly in a way that few people on the outside had anticipated. There were many who thought that North Korea was a model of some economic success, but it proved to be the case after the Soviet Union disappeared that without those massive subsidies from the Soviet Union, there was no real economic cohesion or coherence in North Korea. Now, this shift in the economic balance by the late 1980s began to have, from the North Korean point of view, profound consequences for the military balance between the two countries. And beginning in the 1980s, we began in the United States to become aware that the North Koreans were pursuing a nuclear option of some sort, with, at the beginning, some tentative assistance, at least, from the Soviet Union. And they had built a 5-megawatt nuclear reactor at a place called Yongbyon, which is to the north of Pyongyang. They also built a reprocessing facility in that same neighborhood, which gave them the capacity to reprocess spent nuclear fuel and to extract the plutonium from that nuclear fuel, which in turn gave them fissile material with which, conceivably, if they could have mastered the engineering challenges, would have given them the ability to construct nuclear devices. In the last year or so of the first Bush administration, the U.S. took this issue on very directly and began a series of talks with the North Koreans, trying to figure out how to convince them not to pursue that nuclear option. The South Koreans had earlier, back in the 70s, had their own plans to construct nuclear weapons, and they were dissuaded from doing so only under the very strongest pressure from the U.S., which in fact called into question the very essence of our security relationship in order to cause South Korea to abandon its nuclear plans. This was the situation that then was inherited by the Clinton administration in 1992. We were quite certain that North Korea was pursuing a nuclear option. We had had discussions with them about what it would take to persuade them to give that up, and those discussions had really not come to anything. When the Clinton administration came into office, this was one of the first items on their agenda, not necessarily because they wanted it on their agenda, but because the force of circumstances and time required that they address this problem. And Dean Steinberg was very involved beginning in the early 1990s with the U.S. effort to try to meet this challenge. Finally, after a very tense period in which the North Koreans were, in effect, threatening to use nuclear devices, or at least threatening to launch conventional assaults on South Korea, you may remember that at that point a North Korean general threatened to turn South Korea into a sea of fire if, as the U.S. was beginning to urge the UN passed any sanctions against North Korea as a result of their withdrawal from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and their continued effort to construct nuclear weapons. Finally, in 1994, the U.S., in a negotiation that was led by Bob Gallucci, who is now one of our fellow deans as dean of the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, managed to negotiate something called the Agreed Framework. This is an agreement directly negotiated between the U.S. and North Korea. The essence of the Agreed Framework from the U.S. point of view was that the North Koreans agreed to first freeze and eventually dismantle their nuclear weapons program, which they continued to insist was not a weapons program but was an energy program. And in return, the United States, supported by South Korea and Japan, agreed to construct 2 light water nuclear reactors in North Korea to replace the power that the energy that the North Koreans said they were giving up. And until those reactors were in place, to provide 500,000 metric tons per year of heavy fuel oil, which the North Koreans wanted as a supplement to their existing energy generating capacity. That agreement was produced in October of 1994, the Geneva Agreed Framework. It was an agreement that had generated great controversy within the U.S. And in November of 1994, the Agreed Framework became a political orphan. Because, as some of you who were politically conscious at that time, not all, will remember, that was the year in which the Republican Party gained control of both houses of Congress. And immediately, a situation in which the Republican minorities had been fiercely opposed to the Agreed Framework became a situation in which the Republican majorities were fiercely opposed to the Agreed Framework. And, as I said, instantaneously, the Agreed Framework was a political orphan. Now, for reasons that defy my memory at this point, I had about that time agreed to become executive director of a non-existent organization, a Korean Energy Development Organization, which had no staff, no offices, and worst of all, no money. And our task was to organize ourselves in such a way as to supervise the construction of these light water reactors, and in the meantime to oversee the delivery of the heavy fuel oil to North Korea. By July of that year, of 1995 rather, we had basically put in place the Cato organization, and we had begun dealing with the North Koreans. The Agreed Framework itself was very general about what had to be done, and we had, first of all, to negotiate what we called the supply agreement, which specified in great detail what it was we were going to deliver to the North Koreans, what type of nuclear reactor, the terms and conditions under which it would be constructed, who would be responsible for the construction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This, at that time, was a very controversial undertaking. Not only controversial within the U.S., but also controversial in South Korea and controversial within Japan. Politically, there was no real consensus in either of those two countries as to going forward with the construction of these reactors. And of course, in an all too typical fashion, the U.S. was in a position where we were going to supervise the construction of the light water reactors, but we weren't going to pay for them. That was going to be done by Japan and South Korea under what we usually refer to as burden sharing. But the North Koreans argued, look, we didn't sign this agreement with South Korea and Japan. We signed it with you, the United States, and we want you to do this. We don't want South Koreans coming to North Korea. We don't want Japanese coming to North Koreans. We want Americans. Well, suffice it to say, it took us about 5 months to negotiate this supply agreement, and I'd be happy to talk a little bit at the end of my presentation, if you like, or in the question period, about what it is like to negotiate with North Koreans. It is not a terribly pleasant experience, and when you're negotiating with North Koreans on behalf, at least in part, of South Koreans, it's a particularly difficult place to find yourself. And I used to complain that I was the meat in a Korean sandwich, because I would have the South Koreans coming at me from one end and the North Koreans from the other. In the meantime, we viewed this, as I said, as a pretty strictly nuclear deal. Energy for energy, nuclear energy for nuclear energy. The North Koreans viewed it quite differently, as I soon learned when we began these discussions. From the North Korean point of view, I think, and this is difficult to document at this point, but I think the North Koreans from the beginning viewed this as much more of a political deal than they did an energy deal. For them, this was a path towards something that with some reluctance they had decided they really needed and wanted, and that was a more normal relationship with the United States. The North Korean economy by this time was already showing severe strain. This was 4 years after they'd lost their subsidies from the Soviet Union. The Chinese were continuing to give them some energy and some food, but the North Korean economy was in a downward spiral. This was exacerbated by some floods that they had in some of their agricultural zones, and they had a massive famine in 1995, 96, 97, a massive famine underway in North Korea, with, in retrospect, perhaps as many as 2 million people having died as a result of famine or diseases associated with malnutrition. But for the North Koreans, they wanted some evidence, as we were talking about this and building the nuclear reactors, that the United States was prepared to do some things that we had said we would do in the agreed framework. And that was, for example, to begin lifting the various economic sanctions that were in place to, under certain conditions that had to be negotiated, but also to begin serious establishment of diplomatic representation in the two capitals, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this was not something that was, in retrospect, feasible, given the political shift that had taken place in the United States and the characterization by many in the U.S., and this is to some extent irrespective of political party, although I would say that it was a view held disproportionately on the Republican side of the aisle rather than the Democratic side of the aisle, that somehow the agreed framework was an example of the U.S. succumbing to nuclear blackmail by the North Koreans. So the agreement itself became very unpopular. It was a constant struggle for us to obtain from the U.S. Congress the funding that we had to provide for the purchase of the heavy fuel oil, for the operation of Cato itself, et cetera. Nonetheless, we negotiated the supply agreement. We began to negotiate a number of detailed protocols. We sent a Cato team to the north, where we were to the site where the reactors were to be located. And over the next few years, we in fact began digging holes and pouring concrete and ordering components for nuclear reactors. All of this against a backdrop in which, under the agreed framework, once we reached a point of significant completion, that too remained to be defined, but significant completion of the new reactors, everything would stop, and the IAEA inspectors who had been present at Yongbyon at the 5-megawatt reactor and at the reprocessing facility would come back in to try to recreate the history of what North Korea had done with its nuclear program in the period leading up to 1994, after they had begun to drop out of their IAEA and non-proliferation treaty commitments. And nobody knew how long that was going to take. There was a good deal of skepticism as to whether the North Koreans would ever comply with that obligation, but it was clear that if they didn't comply, they weren't going to get their reactors. And we were probably in 1997, when I left Cato to go off to Korea as ambassador, we were at that point, we thought, 3 or 4 years away from a point at which we could call that provision of the agreed framework into question and require that North Korea come clean, as we put it, about what they had done. We strongly believed, on the basis of largely U.S. but also intelligence from other countries, that they had probably produced enough plutonium for 1 or 2 crude nuclear devices. And that was, of course, in complete violation of their earlier commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, And it was, from a proliferation point of view, an unacceptable condition in which to leave the situation. So that would have had to have been cleaned up in order for us to go forward. I left in 1997. Someone else took on the task of managing Cato and the relationship with the North Koreans. I went off to South Korea. And in South Korea, when I arrived, the Asian financial crisis was in full bloom. The South Korean economy was, the South Koreans thought, with some justification, was collapsing. And Kim Dae-jung was elected president of South Korea in December of 1997. Now, you have to understand that from the point of view of South Korean political history, this was an earth-shaking development. The notion that Kim Dae-jung, who had been under threat of assassination from some of the military regimes earlier in the 70s and in the 80s, would come back and be elected as president of South Korea, and that power would be turned over to him by Kim Young-sam, his predecessor, was a remarkable indication of how far politically South Korea had come since the days of the military rulers. But Kim Dae-jung had always been viewed with suspicion by South Korean conservatives and by the South Korean military precisely because they suspected that he wanted to do a deal with North Korea. And the defining framework of South Korean domestic politics since the end of the Korean War was anti-communism. And in many ways, the political spectrum in South Korea ranged from the far right up to just right of center. It did not go beyond right of center. So to be left on the Korean political spectrum was to be basically beyond the pale. And Kim Dae-jung had been considered to be a leftist in Korean society. And the fact that he was elected president was probably due largely to the fact that, one, Korean voters were younger than they used to be. There were new generations coming to the fore, but also due to the economic crisis, the financial crisis. So one of Kim Dae-jung's first moves was to articulate a new approach toward North Korea. And this eventually became known as his Sunshine Policy. And he consulted very assiduously with the United States, with the Clinton administration, whose ambassador I was at the time in South Korea. And basically what Kim Dae-jung's Sunshine Policy involved was an attempt to use what by that time was South Korea's economic preeminence on the peninsula as a fulcrum with which to leverage discreetly, slowly, gradually change within North Korea in terms of how North Korea viewed its interests on the peninsula. This all played out while the South Koreans were struggling with an economic crisis. The economy had contracted by about 15% in 1998. It started to come back very vigorously. But in June of 2000, with little anticipation, Kim Dae-jung suddenly announced that he was going to North Korea. And you have to either have had a long association with South Korean politics or to be South Korean to understand what a transcendental event this was. And when on June 15, in the year 2000, South Korean television carried intensive coverage of Kim Dae-jung shaking hands with Kim Jong-il at the airport in Pyongyang, it was, nothing was ever quite the same thereafter. The U.S., in the meantime, had gone through a severe reappraisal of our policy toward North Korea. It was clear that the agreed framework was not going to be the kind of vehicle for changing our relationship with North Korea that some had hoped it would be, largely because, again, the Congress was controlled by people who were unwilling to permit the kind of political flexibility that would have been needed to carry out some of the political provisions of the agreed framework, and also because there was not money coming in to make some of those provisions possible. So some of us were warning, particularly those of us in the embassy in Seoul, were warning people like Jim, who was a responsive audience, but others who were less responsive, that at some point the North Koreans were going to become very impatient with us and what they perceived to be our unwillingness to implement the agreed framework. And sure enough, in August of 1998, they made a move to get our attention and the attention of Japan and South Korea. And they fired a Taepodong missile, a long-range missile, off over Japan, which splashed down in the ocean on the other side of Japan. This got our attention, and it got Japan's attention, and public opinion in Japan, in South Korea, and in the United States was very, very alarmed and concerned. The Clinton administration decided that we needed to do something to deal with this, and the most immediate thing, and in some ways the most effective thing, was to ask former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry to lead a full-scale review of U.S. policy toward North Korea, which Bill Perry did. And we carried that out in very close consultation with both Tokyo and Seoul. This was before Kim Dae-jung's visit, of course. And it became clear that if a new U.S. policy or a firmer U.S. policy were going to work, there was one very important requirement, and that is that it had to be implemented in closest cooperation with both South Korea and Japan. We did not have the luxury of acting unilaterally toward North Korea. South Korea especially, but also Japan, had too many of their own equities tied up in the question of how we were going to deal with North Korea, the missile problem, the North Korean nuclear problem. And remember, the agreed framework was still in place, so at least we knew they were not producing any more plutonium. Bill Perry went to Pyongyang in 1999, in April of 1999, and offered the North Koreans a choice. He said, you can go down this path, which is one of greater engagement. We will talk to you about further transparency in your nuclear program. We will talk to you about the need for you to restrain your missile program and to stop selling missile technology to people we don't want to have that missile technology. And we'll talk about prospects for greater economic cooperation, particularly with South Korea and with Japan, and we will go forward from here. Now, if you don't want to do that, the alternative is to go down another path, which will be much, much more difficult for all concerned. He went to North Korea, had difficult but on the whole useful talks, came back from North Korea, and we heard nothing for almost a year. Finally, in the period just after Kim Dae-jung's visit to North Korea, the North Koreans sent an envoy to the U.S. who met with Secretary Albright and, in fact, was received by President Clinton in the Oval Office. And during that meeting, it became clear, at least in my thinking, that North Korea really wanted to try to do a deal. And they invited the Secretary of State to come to Pyongyang, and she went. She was criticized for that very severely by elements in the Republican Party in the U.S., but for a brief time, in the fall of 2000, it looked as though there could really be a breakthrough in this situation that had been basically frozen for almost 50 years. They had invited President Clinton to go to North Korea. I had some question as to whether that was a good idea. But in any case, we ran up against the inexorable American political calendar. And first of all, there was no outcome from our election for 3 weeks or so. And then when that outcome was clear, it was obviously too late to do much more with the North Koreans. And some of us were optimistic that the new Bush administration coming into office would want to pick up the situation largely as it existed then and carry forward and continue to engage with North Korea at a very senior level. and try to see if we couldn't have a breakthrough on these issues of greater nuclear transparency, missile technology, and the political relationship. As we all know, that was not the vision of the Bush administration in its early months and first years. And in fact, Kim Dae-jung came to Washington for a first meeting with the new American president to be told, basically publicly by the president, that it was naive to try to deal with North Korea, that Kim Jong-il was an evil person and that there was no way you could deal with him effectively. So that marked the beginning of a period of deterioration in the general set of relations with North Korea. It marked the beginning of some very severe tension between the U.S. and South Korea. Kim Dae-jung at that point had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and to be told by the American president that it was a mistake to try to deal diplomatically with North Korea was not popular in South Korea, even among those people for whom Kim Dae-jung was Satan incarnate. They didn't like the fact that the American president was not dealing with their president on a basis of mutual respect. Anyway, things went from bad to worse, and in October of 2002, having concluded from intelligence reports that North Korea might well be pursuing an alternative route to nuclear fissile material in the form of enriched uranium, we knew then and we know now that they had had some contacts with the Pakistanis, who were running, in effect, a one-stop shop for nuclear technology. And we believed, we had evidence, we thought, I was not in the administration, but there was a strong feeling that we had discovered that they were pursuing this alternative technology. So we stopped deliveries of heavy fuel oil. They said, okay, the agreed framework is dead. They threw out the inspectors from the International Energy Agency, and they said they were going to resume operation of the 5-megawatt reactor, and that would give them spent fuel, and the reprocessing facility would give them the ability to produce more plutonium. And that is, in fact, what has happened. We now, our intelligence estimates are, and those of international organizations are, that instead of fissile material for 1 or 2 nuclear devices, the North Koreans now probably have fissile material for 6 to 12 nuclear devices. They also, as we all know, did a nuclear test last year, which was not an outstanding technical success, but it did go bang, and it did demonstrate that they had the ability to create a nuclear device. In the meantime, there was diplomatic activity which has now culminated in some developments that may be the cause for optimism. The Chinese in particular and the South Koreans have been instrumental in putting together a so-called 6-party process with the encouragement of the Bush administration, which is an attempt to bring together all of North Korea's neighbors to deal with the problem of the nuclear program. And that 6-party process has been both on again, off again, start, stop. In September of 2005, produced a statement of principles which seemed at that point very promising, but in an action that remains somewhat unexplained, the U.S. Treasury Department announced that they were freezing North Korean accounts at a bank in Macau. This all becomes this, you couldn't write novels about this because no one would believe it. The negotiations finally resumed in February, and with the strong leadership of Chris Hill, who was the U.S. negotiator, on the 13th of February, they announced the conclusion of a tentative agreement which called for North Korea to get their $25 million back and to begin a process of opening up their nuclear program in return for some more deliveries of heavy fuel oil. They were supposed to as of this past weekend, have frozen the Yongbyon nuclear facilities and to have invited back the IAEA inspectors and gotten 50,000 metric tons of fuel oil. And then they are supposed to proceed to a point at which they are fessing up as to what their nuclear programs look like, to come clean about how much fissile material they have produced, and eventually to give up that fissile material, each step being synchronized with the delivery of more heavy fuel oil and the work of various working groups, including one between the U.S. and North Korea, to work on the prospects for normalization. Now, I must say all of this is I think, quite promising. I think any agreement, and this is not a great agreement, but it's better than no agreement. It is not as far along as we could have been under the agreed framework. In fact, we were further along under the agreed framework in 2001, but it is a start. And most importantly, I think it has demonstrated that, to some extent at least, the division within the U.S. government that I think had prevented our coming to this point earlier, when we could have had this agreement 3 or 4 years ago if we really wanted it. But there has been this severe disagreement within the administration as to whether we are prepared to try to negotiate an agreement with North Korea, to try to deal with their denuclearization through diplomatic channels, or whether the only solution is a change in the regime itself in North Korea. And that division, I think, still exists, but for the moment at least, because of other circumstances in the world, including Iraq and Iran, for the moment at least, the administration has concluded that it's going to try the diplomatic route. As you've read in the press, I hope over the last couple of days, the North Koreans did not, in fact, freeze their nuclear facilities this past weekend as they were supposed to. They have said they didn't do it because they didn't get their $25 million as soon as they should have. Christopher Hill has said that he believes we will regain some momentum in this negotiation and that the North Koreans will indeed freeze the facility in the relatively near future. It's all a little indefinite, but it does seem to me there is at least a good prospect that this agreement will move forward as it was scheduled to. Now, will it result in North Korea giving up its nuclear programs entirely? There I become quite skeptical. It seems to me that there remain, one on each side, a strategic question that North Korea has not yet answered for itself, and a strategic question that I'm not certain the U.S. has yet answered. For the North Koreans, the strategic question is, can that regime survive without the reality or perhaps the illusion that it has a nuclear deterrent, that too much pressure on them could result in their use of a nuclear deterrent. I don't think that Kim Jong-il has yet really answered that question, and he could well, I suspect, be in effect playing for time. Time is not really on his side, but I think the possibility exists that he may be waiting to see what the next U.S. administration has on offer with regard to his nuclear program. For the U.S., the unanswered strategic question is, I think, is there any agreement which gives us sufficient certainty that North Korea has in fact given up its nuclear program, that makes it safe for us to sign? North Korea is a country of caves and tunnels and a proven record of evading some of these commitments in a very visible fashion. Is there any agreement that would offer us a high level of assurance that they're not somehow cheating on their commitment to give up the nuclear weapons program? And I don't know that we're going to answer that question in the near term, nor in my own mind is it necessary that we come up now with a definitive answer to the question. I think it is important that we continue to be engaged with the North Koreans, and that assuming they in the next few days or a couple of weeks do what they said they were going to do in the Beijing Declaration of February 13, I think it's very important to continue to march down up that path with them. But whether it's going to produce ultimately a denuclearized North Korea, beyond the shadow of a doubt, I am skeptical about that. In the meantime, however, we are at least back on a common path with our most important ally on this issue, which is South Korea, and we're back on a path which is not in conflict with the views and interests of China. As this has developed, it has been for China, in some respects, a windfall opportunity to demonstrate that they have acquired great diplomatic and political clout over these issues. Now, we say that that's good, and I guess ultimately it is good, but to the extent that political influence is a zero-sum proposition, China's rise, I think, means that we have less. And that may be a good consequence, maybe an acceptable consequence of the current situation, but I think that it reinforces the notion in East Asia that China is a power on the rise and the U.S. is a power which is basically, at best, stable. So we will see over the next few months as to where this process is going to go. We continue, I think, to confront the same set of alternatives that we have confronted on the Korean Peninsula since before the agreed framework of 1994, and that is we can try to negotiate this problem away, or we can, theoretically at least, use force and sanctions to prevent North Korea from becoming a nuclear power. I think in some ways the horse is already out of the barn in that respect, and I think also that the other major countries in the region are terrified at the prospect of the U.S. deciding that it can't tolerate a nuclear North Korea and must react by force. Or thirdly, and this may well be where we end up, we and the other countries of the region are going to have to reconcile ourselves to the need to manage North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. That's not something that I look forward to with eagerness, largely because I think North Korea is a very fragile state, and I do not have much confidence that where they are today is necessarily where they're going to be in the future. If that regime should begin to crumble, I would be very concerned as to who gets control of the nuclear weaponry and who has use of it. We all focus on the nuclear question, as we should. But in the longer term, I think the real problem in Northeast Asia is the existence of what is in effect a failed state at the heart of the most dynamic economic region of the world and one of the most important political economic zones in the world, particularly for the U.S., but of course for all those other countries in the neighborhood as well. And as long as North Korea continues to exist in the state that it now exists, there is going to be an ongoing threat of instability on the Korean Peninsula and an ongoing threat of instability in Northeast Asia. So I separate the current outlook, which is modestly optimistic that we will continue some form of diplomatic engagement, we will manage this process going forward, from the long-term prospects on the Korean Peninsula, which in my personal judgment are going to remain very troubling until and unless there is some change in the political configuration of North Korea. And by that I mean probably some increasing process of reunification of the two Koreas. Now that's difficult even to imagine under current circumstances, but I think if we are concerned about stability on the peninsula, that almost by definition we have to be thinking in the longer term about how the two Koreas could come closer together Clearly, the North Korean model is not the model that is going to provide the guidance for the reunification of Korea in any fashion. It will have to be done on South Korean terms. And of course, one of the major impediments there is that at the moment there is a distinct lack of enthusiasm in South Korea for taking on the burden of reunification. And they, wrongly in my view, but understandably, would like to kick that problem down the road into the future for as long as possible, even though you can argue that the costs of reunification will be greater 5 years from now than they would be now, will be greater still 10 years from now or 15 years from now. But South Korea is a democratic process, and decision-making in democratic processes is not science. It's much more of an art form. Let me say just a few words about my own contacts with the North Koreans during my time at Cato. First of all, I would recommend to you all a book which has just come out. And I don't normally go around recommending murder mysteries as the basis for obtaining greater political understanding. But there is a book which has just been published, and it's called A Corpse in the Koryo. The Koryo in this instance being the Koryo Hotel in Pyongyang. It's written by a man who, on the book, his name is given as James Church. He is described as a former Western intelligence agent. I don't have the foggiest idea who he is. But he has written a book about the central protagonist being a deputy police chief in North Korea, connected with one of the very many security services. And the book is fascinating because he describes in a way which it's difficult to imagine you could do if you were not intimately familiar with how that system works. He describes basically day-to-day life by a functionary, in this case a functionary of the security services in North Korea. And I think this is just a fascinating exercise, and based on my own exposure to North Koreans, both in New York and also in Pyongyang and over at the reactor site in Shimpo, he got it very right. This is how life is there. But one of the things you come away from from this book, and one of the things that I came away with from my own personal contacts with North Koreans, is that they're not crazy. They are human beings. They have a very different view of the world, some of which is sort of inculcated in them involuntarily. They are separated for the most part from their parents at a very early age. They're educated by the state. They learn to basically accept, or at least they say they accept, without questioning the wisdom of Kim Jong-il and before him Kim Il-sung. Although if you read A Corpse in the Koryo, you begin to understand that maybe that unquestioning attitude toward their own leadership is not total. But nonetheless, this is a country which is run by probably the world's greatest narcissist. Kim Jong-il is not, in my judgment, crazy. And when Secretary Albright met with him, she was surprised to find that there was a basis for rational, informed engagement intellectually. But he is also a man who, from the age of 1, grew up being surrounded by people who wore his portrait on their lapels. So if there is any recipe for narcissism, I think that's probably it. Where that regime goes in the future, I don't know. But I haven't found anybody who has a better notion of what might be possible than Kim Dae-jung and his original Sunshine policy. Gradually, slowly, carefully, cause the place to open up, recognizing that at some point Kim Jong-il is going to say, well, I'm not going to open up anymore because that's contrary to my own interests of survival. But if you can, I think, create enough opportunity for opening, enough of a vested interest among some constituents in North Korea for further opening, that you can imagine a situation in which gradually the power of the regime begins to attenuate. The alternative, of course, is that we'll all wake up some morning and something will have gone bang in the night in North Korea. And I don't rule that out for a moment, and I would not be all that surprised if it were to happen. I would be shocked, but not all that surprised. This is a society under great stress, and at some point it could well crack. So let me stop there and see if, in that long exposition of the history of the Korean Peninsula, I've managed to provoke any questions or comments. Yes?
Actually, Korean unification is my own special topic. And regarding South Korea's unification policy, which right now is called Peace and Prosperity, which is a continuation of such a policy, it seems like they're moving away from sudden collapse and absorption scenario as in Germany because of high cost. And they want to do this gradually, as you said, open up Korea, North Korea, trying to introduce some market system and with a long time horizon. But when I was talking to this one person, he said that Ministry of Education handles this should be renamed Ministry of Division, because really what they're doing is to try to prolong the situation. So do you think that the current policy, South Korea's policy, really is geared towards unification or something else?
No, I think you've got it about right. I don't think there is a strong view in South Korea that their interests would be well served by early reunification. I'm not sure that nationally they've thought this through very well, because I think they're probably wrong if they're calculating it just in terms of financial and economic costs. I think they're also concerned, though, about the social costs of reunification. And in truth, we all sort of assume that South Korea continues to want reunification. I think for younger generations of South Koreans, if you would put them in an isolation booth and ask them the question, and they felt able to answer it honestly, I think there would be much more ambivalence about reunification than we and most South Koreans assume. South Koreans look around, particularly those under the age of 40. They look around and they say great prosperity, great progress that South Korea has made. They look to the north, they see an impoverished country which is basically a charity case from their point of view. And they say, first of all, what do we have to fear? How are these guys going to hurt us? And secondly, they look at their new car, their new flat, their desire to educate their children, and they say, but how am I going to do all this if I've got to, as the West Germans did, either borrow a lot of money in the longer term or pay higher taxes now? I'm not going to be able to do what I want to do. So I think there is a great deal of ambivalence in South Korea. And I think, the first instinct on the part of many South Koreans, if they began to see signs of wobbling in the north, their instinct would be to find the next strongman to take over in North Korea, not to sort of open up and say, okay, you all come. They don't want to go through what they think the Germans went through. Yes?
What does IAEA stand for?
International Atomic Energy Agency. It's located in Vienna. You may have heard of it in connection with the war in Iraq and the inspections that the IAEA had been carrying out to try to verify Iraqi compliance with their commitments at the end of the first Gulf War. They are now very involved in the situation in Iran, but they are the appointed watchdog of the commitments that countries made to each other under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And those were that basically, other than the declared nuclear weapon state, no other countries would embark upon a nuclear weapons program. The problem, as we have seen in Iran, is that it is not easy to differentiate between the development of nuclear power for electricity, for example, or peaceful uses, and the development of nuclear power which if a country were willing to cheat on its obligations and to do things secretly, could lead to the production of nuclear weapons. And in fact, we know that Iran kept secret a nuclear program for a long period of time. Yes?
China has played a much stronger role lately in the negotiations with North Korean settlement than it did in the previous nuclear crisis. But for the Chinese, they use this to a great degree also for their international image and to shape their relationship with the United States. How far can the U.S. allow the Chinese to control this situation when, to some extent, it's in the Chinese interest to perpetuate the crisis just at a slightly lower level so that they become the go-to?
I'm not sure I would agree that it's in China's interest to see the crisis perpetuated. I think, very bluntly, China has three interests, and as in the case of most things Chinese, they're expressed in threes and frequently no's. But the threes this time are no nukes, no war, and no collapse. They want a continuation of the status quo on the Korean Peninsula. And I think their great fear would be that if North Korea, deliberately flaunts its willingness to pursue nuclear weapons to a particular point, maybe they're already at that point, that it would provoke a reaction from the United States that would be threatening to Chinese interests of stability and tranquility on the Korean Peninsula. I don't personally believe that China has it in its power to cause North Korea to do things that the North Koreans conclude would jeopardize the survival of the regime. We, I think, tend very much to overemphasize or exaggerate China's influence on North Korea, and China tends to understate its influence. I think, as we've seen over the last few months, when push comes to shove, they can push North Korea in a certain direction. I think they have on occasion, as I've said, pinched the feeding tube that goes down to North Korea. But they don't cut it off, because as much as they don't want to see North Korea have nuclear weapons in a sort of established fashion, neither do they want North Korea to collapse. And their views coincide very much with South Korea's views. For the U.S., we have a rather simpler set of interests on the Korean Peninsula. We all share a common interest in not wanting North Korea to permanently have nuclear weapons. But once you get beyond that, we have very different interests. Yes, sir. Yes.
How effective are nuclear weapons in protecting a country from American invasion or intervention, which North Korea doesn't like? Do you think Iraq would not have been invaded by the United States if Iraq had nuclear weapons?
Well, I think you have to start by asking yourself whether the North Koreans would believe that had Saddam Hussein or Milosevic had nuclear weapons, whether the United States and, in the case of Serbia, NATO, would they have done to those countries what we did to those countries? I think it's a little simplistic, but I think nonetheless North Korea, Kim Jong-il that is, believes that if he has a nuclear deterrent, or if we think he may have a nuclear deterrent, that we're not going to whack him. Now, I would argue that the chances of our whacking him are very small anyway. We may put a lot of pressure on him. We may, intensify economic sanctions, etc. But given the interests of South Korea, Japan, China, and us, I can't imagine really a circumstance in which we would actually use violence against North Korea, military power against North Korea. I know that in 1994 there were reports that the U.S. was prepared to do that, and I've talked to some of my later colleagues in government about where they were on that particular issue. And it may be that we continue to say that we're prepared. All options are on the table, which is one of the favorite phrases of the the U.S. national security apparatus. I don't personally believe that all options are on the table. I don't think they were necessarily on the table in 1994. Anyway. Yes?
Could you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by a failed state?
A failed state is basically a state that's unable to provide for its own population, and therefore whose survival is in question, and who is prepared to do things, extraordinary things, in order to try to assure that survival. Yeah. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that if asked, you would describe what it's like to negotiate with the North Koreans.
Well, first, as I indicated, they're not crazy, and they're not completely irrational, and they can be very difficult, and they can shout at you, and they can scream, and they can, as they did to Bob Gallucci, throw ashtrays at you. They never did that to me, but it's not a pleasant experience. On the other hand, you get outside of that particular bubble that you're in, and they'll go out for lunch, they'll talk about their families, they're people. You know, they're not just empty suits. They have a negotiating style which I think is not necessarily in their own interests, and that is they put out a maximum set of demands, and they say, we must have all of this or we're going to go home. So when you say to them, well, I can't possibly give you even a little bit of that, I mean, that's just that's something I can't really deal with. So I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. But they don't go home, or at least not usually. And at some point, having pushed this position to what seems to be a ridiculous extreme, at least in my experience with them, suddenly you walk into a new session and they say, well, we'll agree to this, this, and this, and they'll give away 90% of what they had earlier said was non-negotiable. So it's also they are very conscious of the question of respect and face. There's good evidence that some of the early difficulties that we had in dealing with them, particularly at the end of the last Bush administration, were a result of what they viewed as our rudeness and refusal to take them seriously, to give them the kind of treatment that they believed was due to them. That the head of the U.S. side would not go down and meet them at the door as they came in. That the head of the U.S. side would not go down and say goodbye to them as they left. That we kept them waiting around, that we were not respectful. Perhaps because they are so weak in many ways, they treat those questions of respect and face in a much more important fashion than we do in the West. They're sort of Asia squared. I mean, it's really these are important questions for them. Yes?
In the past 6 years, we've been trying to curtail North Korean economic interests to elicit arms sales to Yemen, for example,
yeah.
Some of the counterfeit. Is this working against our interests in the terms of North Korea opening up? If we continue to stranglehold their economy, are we working against our own interests? What do you think?
Well, I think simply to approach North Korea with a kind of implacable attitude of total hostility, not being willing to engage with them, and to say that we want you gone, and therefore we're not going to allow you anything, is probably not in our interest. On the other hand, even I'm very basically quite convinced of the need to negotiate with North Korea. I'm a little uncomfortable with what's happened in the last week or two. We've gone from a position in which we've said publicly that we can't give all this money back because it would be a violation of U.S. law. Half of it is the result of illegal enterprise, to a position now of saying, here it is, take it all. And I'm not sure that that's the right kind of lesson to leave with the North Koreans. I think you've got to absolutely insist that they adhere to the letter of every agreement that they've reached. On the other hand, we were in a difficult position because there was not unanimity among the other parties, the six-party process, that it was the right thing for the U.S. to do. And sometimes the U.S. government, as Dean Steinberg will recall, is so large and so complicated that the right hand does things that the left hand doesn't know are going on. And I suspect this may have been the case with regard to the Treasury freeze on these accounts in the Bank Delta Asia in Macau. It was passing strange that that freeze was announced a few days after the statement of principles was agreed in the six-party process. One more question? Yeah.
Is, in your view, is there room for a deal in which Korean Peninsula will be unified under Southern leadership in return for nuclear capability?
No. I don't worry about South Korea becoming a nuclear weapons state. And I've never engaged with anybody serious in South Korea who has suggested that ultimately it's in South Korea's interest for North Korea to acquire nuclear weapons because eventually there will be one Korea and those nuclear weapons will belong to the South. I think the people who are making these decisions in South Korea are very aware of the fact that given their geopolitical situation, to become a nuclear weapons state would lessen their security, not enhance it. And some of their scientists play around with some of these things from time to time. They do not like being treated as a second-class citizen from a technological point of view, but I think they are firmly on line with regard to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and their own commitments not to develop nuclear weapons.
Well, thanks, Steve, for a terrific presentation. Steve was good enough to do a little book blurb for this crime novel that's come out, which I've heard about but haven't had a chance to read yet, but now very motivated to do. Let me do a little blurb for one of his writings, a book that at least my students have seen, that he did with Ambassador Moore to Bromwell. It's called Chasing the Sun, which is a quite compact but trenchant analysis of the political situation in East Asia and some prescriptions for U.S. policy going forward. I suspect Steve doesn't get any royalties out of this because I think it's a Century Foundation publication, but nonetheless it's an incredibly valuable and insightful read, and I recommend it to all of you. So once again, thanks all for coming. There are refreshments standing in the back. They're all ready for us, and please stay and enjoy the refreshments for our reception.